In Essential Task 10.1, we are going to discuss the basic principles of sensation. I recommend a horizontal piece of paper for today's concept map. Some of you with smaller handwriting might be able to hold the piece of paper vertically, but I think for the majority of people, horizontal is the best. I will now allow you to pause the video before proceeding into the concept map. As we begin this unit, I should note the name of the unit is Sensation and Perception. In Essential Task 10.1, we are going to describe the term sensation and define it, and also talk about some of the influences to the concept of sensation. Whether it's today or throughout the entire unit, whenever we use the word sensation, we're talking about experiencing sensory stimulation. So I'm talking about anything from light waves triggering the sense of vision, sound waves with hearing, taste sensation, smell sensation, touch sensation. If we're talking about experiencing sensory stimulation, and then oftentimes talking about some of the anatomical structures in our body related to those sensation stimulations, we're talking about sensation as a whole. As the unit progresses, we'll talk about individual senses. So, for example, we'll talk about the sense of vision in an essential task, the sense of hearing in an essential task, and then combine some of the other senses in another essential task. We'll also talk about perception, something that we'll define in a later concept. Today, though, we're going to talk about things related to sensation broadly that apply to more than one individual sense. So, for example, on the left side under thresholds, there are absolute thresholds for all of our major senses. Absolute thresholds are the absolute minimal amount of stimulation necessary to detect a sensory stimulation. There should be an S between the N and the O here. There's a bit of a typo. So, for example, if I gave you a glass of water and put one single granule of salt into the water, you wouldn't be able to taste the fact that there was salt in the water. That's because one granule of salt has yet to reach the absolute threshold for the sensation of taste. As you can see here, it would take 1 teaspoon of sugar dissolved in 2 gallons of water to actually detect, in that case, sugar. So to go to sugar instead of salt, if I just put 1 granule of sugar into 2 gallons of water, you wouldn't be able to tell that the water became sugary because that had yet to reach your absolute threshold. Your absolute threshold across any of your senses is the bare minimum necessary to detect the sensation. For example, if you look here at the table, which you don't necessarily have to copy down, but I think it's useful to see, you typically can see a candle from 30 miles away on a clear night, a single candle 30 miles away. But that is just the absolute bare minimum. If that candle was 35 miles away, you almost assuredly would be unable to see it because at that point it would not reach your minimal absolute threshold. So this is the idea of, wow, I can just barely see that. I can just barely taste that. I can just barely feel that. I can just barely smell that. So across all of your major senses, I look at the word absolute and I think of the phrase, it is the absolute first minimal amount necessary for you to sense something, for you to experience sensory stimulation and actually detect it. The other term under threshold is called the difference threshold. This is the second under the threshold category. On the other hand, the difference threshold is the absolute bare minimum necessary for you to detect that a sensory stimulation has got stronger or weaker in overall stimulation strength, so that there's been a difference or a change. So, for example, to go back to the table on the other side, we noted that it takes 1 teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water for you to detect that the water has a sugary flavor. The next question is, though, related to difference threshold, how much more sugar would I need to add for you to detect that the drink became more sugary? How many more packets or how many more granules of sugar would it be necessary for you to detect that it actually got more sugary? For example, and this works with things like weight too. Let's say you're holding a stack of pieces of paper. It looks like there's 5 or 6 pieces of paper. If you were holding these pieces of paper and I added one single piece of paper to the top of it, would you be able to detect that it got heavier? You might be able to. But what if I had a giant stack of paper, a really big stack of paper like this? Would you be able to tell that I added one piece of paper on top? Probably not. What I'm doing right now is illustrating the difference threshold. The difference threshold, again, is the amount that's necessary for you to detect that a stimulation changed in strength. And what's interesting about this is that it's determined by what's called Weber's law. Weber's law states that the difference threshold is not based on some type of consistent amount. It's based on a percentage change. So, for example, when I only have 4 or 5 pieces of paper in my hand and I add one more piece of paper on top, I can basically tell that there's been a change. I just added 20% more weight when I go from 5 to 6. I can more or less tell that the piece of paper in my hand got heavier. But when I have 100 pieces of paper in my hand, if I add one piece of paper on top, that's only a 1% change. I'm not really going to notice that. It's too small of a change to actually detect. Even though the stack of paper got heavier from 100 to 101, it didn't really increase by a dramatic amount. It increased by a very small percentage, and as a result, you were unable to detect the change. We call this phenomenon Weber's law, where it's not like I can add one piece of paper and then another one, and then another one, and then another one, and then another one, and you always tell that the stack of paper got heavier. It needs to be by a certain percentage. So, for example, if I'm holding 100 pieces of paper, I might need to add 6 pieces of paper, 7 pieces of paper in order to actually detect that it got heavier. Same thing goes with drinks. So think back to that example with sugar and water, and we alluded to this a little bit in the last little bit of this current box. We have 2 gallons of water, and you put 1 teaspoon into the water of sugar, and you can detect that the water has a sugary flavor to it. That's step 1. But if I added 1 granule of sugar to that, you wouldn't be able to detect the difference. Maybe it takes another, let's say, half teaspoon before you can detect that there's actually a change in flavor. Great. But what if I added, and this might sound silly, 100 packets of sugar to your water, your 2-gallon jug of water? You're going to sip it and it's going to be super sugary. I could add 101, another one single more packet, and there's no way that you'd be able to taste the change, because the difference between 100 packets of water and 100 packets of sugar and water and 101 packets of sugar and water isn't really going to taste very different. There's already so much sugar there. It might take 20 more packets or 5 more packets or 10 more packets before you actually detect the change in the flavor, before you actually go and say, wow, this water is now more sugary than it was before. I can actually detect the fact that it changed. And it's not because one single packet of sugar will always produce a change in detection. It's because the change in detection is only registered when it reaches a certain percent. So to give you even another example, because Weber's law is one of those things that unfortunately we're not able to sort of demo through YouTube, but I just want to kind of illustrate this, and maybe this visual will make sense as to how Weber's law works. If we put 1 paperclip into an envelope, you would absolutely 100% be able to tell that it got heavier. If I had an envelope, though, that already had, let's say, 1,000 paperclips in it, I know that's dramatic, but just for the sake of example, I can't add a single paperclip and expect you to tell the difference. The difference between 1,000 paperclips and 1,001 paperclips is very minimal. There's no way that you would be able to detect the difference. So if you go back and look at the definition, it states that the difference threshold, detecting in this case if something got heavier, is based on overall percentage changes, not by a consistent amount. So that consistent amount of 1 paperclip again and again and again, it might work at the beginning, but once you get to enough paperclips in the bag, you're not going to be able to tell the difference anymore. We call that idea here Weber's law. The other element today is under the influences category. There are 2 terms that are applicable to all of our senses. The first is called sensory adaptation. Sensory adaptation is the idea that when we stimulate our senses for a prolonged period of time, we see that the experience of sensation weakens. So, for example, the best example, you walk into a bakery, it smells incredible. You get this rush of smell sensation. Your olfactory receptors go crazy. We'll talk about what those are later in this essential task, or rather in this unit. But after 20 minutes of being in the bakery, you barely even notice it when you leave. Well, what happened? You experience sensory adaptation, where after being constantly exposed to a stimulation, in this case, the wonderful smell of the bakery, the overall experience of that sensation has weakened, it has dropped, because your body has just gotten used to it. The sensory receptors responsible for, in this case, the sense of smell, were stimulated too long, were stimulated for a prolonged period of time, and now those neurons responsible for sending information to your brain about what it is that you're experiencing actually fire less. They actually trigger less action potentials. The same is true with things like jewelry. I wear a Apple Watch every day. If I were to take this Apple Watch off and move it to my other hand, it would feel really weird. The reason why it feels weird on the opposite side of my body is that the neurons for the sense of touch on my left wrist are used to the fact that I wear a watch basically every single day. The neurons on the right side of my wrist, though, on my right wrist, are not used to that. Those neurons are virtually never stimulated for something like that. So it actually would feel really weird to move that article of, in this case, jewelry or electronics, over to the opposite side of my body. The same is true for my wallet. My wallet is usually in my back right pocket. If I were to move my wallet to my back left pocket, it would feel really weird because my body is used to the sensory stimulation in my back right pocket. The same is true with any jewelry. If you have any rings on, any chains on, anything jewelry-wise, shift around where on the body it is. Your body typically undergoes sensory adaptation in relation to the things that you typically wear, whether that's the location of your wallet, whether that's even the location of your keys, whether that's jewelry. The second you start to shift that, put your wallet in a pocket it never goes in, put your phone in a pocket it never goes in, put your jewelry on hands or fingers that they never go on, put your keys in a pocket they never go in. You're going to experience that awkward feeling, and it's because those new parts of your body have not experienced the sensory adaptation. So it applies with your jewelry. It also applies with, in the context of this, that rush of smell sensation that you experience walking into a bakery. Last final example. I know when I was your age, there was undoubtedly a very specific smell at the nursing home I worked at. And usually when the first 10 minutes of getting to work, there was that rush of a smell that typically wasn't super pleasant, even in the kitchen. But after those 10 minutes, my body got used to it, my sensation got used to it, and as a result, an hour into the shift, you barely even noticed it. Well, that's sensory adaptation. What might seem like an unpleasant or even in some cases nice smell if you work in a bakery for the first 20 minutes is seemingly gone by the time you leave or by the time you transition into another part of your day. Each case, it's sensory adaptation. The last thing to note, and the demo here that's being described is precisely the sensory adaptation example with your jewelry. The last thing to talk about is called signal detection theory. Signal detection theory tries to identify why certain sensory stimulations are easier to detect than others, and it seems to be that when we are motivated to detect certain sensory stimulations, we're more likely to do so. A couple classic examples. You ever been in a loud environment but hear your name, even if it's not directed towards you, and your head kind of tilts up and you're like, somebody said my name. Well, throughout your entire life, you've been motivated to hear your name. So there seems to be a connection between your ability to detect a certain sensory stimulation in a really crowded environment or in an environment where there's a lot of sensory stimulation going on and your overall motivation to do so. Same is true with your phone. You ever feel like you can hear your ringtone even though you're in an environment that's really, really loud? Well, you are also equally as motivated to hear your ringtone or your text message tone. And as a result, even if the environment that you're in is really loud or there's a lot of sensory stimulation going on from people talking to just other noise in the background, you are still able to hear things that you're motivated to hear. When we talk about this in the context of our auditory sensation or hearing, it's called the cocktail party effect. And it literally kind of means the ability to converse with someone at a cocktail party. Whether it's prom, whether it's a dance, whether it's anything in between, whether it's just a party. If you're in a really loud environment, you are able to carry on a conversation with someone even though there's a ton of competing sensory stimulations. If you go to a crowded party, there is a lot of sensory stimulations in that environment that are above your absolute threshold. Again, the minimal amount to detect something. But even though there is a ton of sensory stimulation bombarding you above your absolute threshold, you're still able to converse with someone because you're motivated to hear what they're saying. You're motivated to respond to their responses. As a result, we call that the cocktail party effect, where you are clearly motivated to carry on a conversation with someone, and you're able to detect exclusively that sensory stimulation coming from that person and kind of drown out all of that background noise. So even though the people across the room are talking loudly, the people behind you are conversing, there's music playing, there's a bunch of smell sensation from things that are cooking, you can still focus on the conversation at hand because you're motivated to do so. Broadly, we call that signal detection theory. More specifically, when it comes to conversing with an individual, we call it hearing. One other example that the College Board has cited before, let's say you go to a concert and you know one of your good friends is the lead guitar player, maybe the bassist, let's say the bass guitar player. And you really want to hear your friend play, but it's in the middle of a concert. There's a lead singer, there's drum, there's multiple guitarists. Even with all of that competing sensory stimulation, if you feel like you want to hear and focus on just the bass guitar, you might be able to kind of drown out some of the other sensory stimulations, auditory, going on at the concert and hear your friend because you're motivated to do so under those conditions. So whether it's conversing at a crowded prom, a crowded party, or listening to your friend at a concert, those are all examples broadly of signal detection theory, but then specifically in the manner of conversing, the cocktail party effect.